Welcome to Azelinguistics. This channel is about all things linguistic, discussing topics in phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and sociolinguistics. So let's see what we've got today. What is language? It is often said that what distinguishes humans from other animals is language. You can speak a language when you can produce sounds that convey meaning and you can understand the meanings that others convey to you through the sounds they make. So if you can just produce sounds and you can hear sounds, it doesn't mean you know a language. You know a language when you have a way of figuring out meaning which is not inside the sounds from the sounds. That's what language is. So language is not the sounds themselves. It is the system with which we use sounds to refer to things outside the sounds. So the system that we have. So if somebody can just make language sounds randomly or is able to physically hear them, but he cannot establish that relationship between sounds and meaning, they don't know a language. What is important here is like the two-tier communication that is happening. So you have the level of sounds and the physical perception and comprehension, but then you have the references that are attached to the sounds, and which are quite arbitrary. There is no logical relationship between sounds and what they mean. For example, table in Spanish is mesa. Interestingly, in Persian, it is miz, which sounds very similar. And I think it used to be mez. And then in German, it's tisch. So you see, in different languages for the same object, you're having different set of sounds, which indicates that the sound-meaning relationship is quite arbitrary. Well, there are a few partial exceptions, like onomatopoeic sound that copy what's going on in nature. But unless there is a conspiracy and all these languages are somehow deeply related and there's something going on deep down which you don't understand yet and you may understand in 1,000 years, there is no relationship between sounds and meaning. At least for now, that's the science. This can also tell us about the history of language, like how language was invented. Well, probably the interesting thing about language is the parts of the body that we use to produce sounds are not actually primarily for language. Like your mouth is for eating and your windpipe is for breathing and your nasal cavity is for breathing and stuff like that. But then because there is air going in and coming out, then we can make sounds. So language is just an invention. It's like using something for a secondary purpose, okay? So that's the second point which is interesting about language. So probably language was a gradual invention, like computer was. Like first there was abacus and people started making these mechanical things which gradually evolved into computers. Probably people figured out they could make sounds and then maybe copy sounds. Gradually the system evolved. So the theory is that sometime around 50 to 100,000 years ago, our ancestors figured out that they could make certain sounds. And then they said, oh, why not shape those sounds into different sounds? And then they made a distinction between sounds and they applied different meanings to these sounds. So they shaped all these different sounds and they started giving them meaning and to communicate. Isn't that interesting? I focused on sounds. So you might say, what about deaf people or people who can't produce and perceive sounds the way most people do? They can't hear, but they sign. They have sign language. Well, the thing is, those people use other signs instead of sounds. They use the hand gestures for the most part. But the system with which their language functions is pretty similar to the common language that most people use. They have replaced the signs because they don't have access to sounds. So the only thing they had to replace was the sounds, which they replaced with physical gestures. But it's functioning pretty much the same way. It has the same structure, but the signs are different. They're not sounds, they're physical gestures. What about written language, right? Because there's no sounds in written language. Well, spoken language came around 50 to 100,000 years ago, but written language has been around for about 5,000. So basically the primary form of language was spoken language. So later people, for some reason, and initially it wasn't even to record language, it was like for bookkeeping and stuff like that, that people started marking things and they started keeping records like that, and it gradually evolved into writing, ideograms and writing systems, and then later into the alphabet. Then they used it to record language. So writing systems were initially used to record spoken language. The spoken language that was written was not as transitory as the spoken language itself. So it could stick around for much longer or even forever and could be copied around, which would provide the opportunity for people to reflect on them for longer periods of time. This resulted in written language increasingly getting more prestige compared to spoken language, which was transitory in nature, especially before there was any sound recording technology available. And then people started to take written language more seriously than spoken language, and they thought it's the best form of language. So gradually there was like literary genres, and it was mixed with art and literature. So there was this perception for a long time that there is a correct language, and that is a literary language, or that is a written language, but that doesn't necessarily match how language evolved. I think we can also make a note of the verbal traditions that people who couldn't actually write, they tried to memorize what other people said, and they could try to pass it to the next generations by the word of mouth. That was a way of recording, so recording in memory. That's something notable. Initially, when writing was invented, people looked down upon writing because it would mean that your memory is going to get lazy, and that's not a good thing. So people, like, sometimes they just say, oh, it's not a good thing. Somebody could like burn your library, but they couldn't burn your mind because they didn't know there's information. How about bees? Don't bees and perhaps other animals have a language? Well, bees and other animals may have communication systems, but for a communication system to be called a language, it has to fulfill certain criteria, which the communication systems of bees and other animals in general do not fulfill. Therefore, although the word language is occasionally loosely used to refer to such communication systems, they technically are not. So what is important is that in a language, you have knowledge of sounds, which is phonetics. They have knowledge of how to put the sounds together, which is phonology. How to create words, which is morphology. You have the knowledge of what the sounds refer to, which is semantics. And you know how to combine the words, which is syntax. What is creativity? This is one of the properties of human language. The fact that we can combine words to form phrases and then phrases to form sentences. So basically the fact that there is an infinite number of sentences that we can create, and then we can also potentially understand an infinite number of sentences that other people can create. That's creativity. Because we know syntax, then if you speak a language, you know what sentence is possible and what sentence is not possible in the language. For example, Bob saw the old man who had a little dog. Now, this is a grammatical sentence in English, right? So, but if I say who had a little dog, Bob saw the old man, that's not a grammatical sentence in English. So if you speak English, you would know that this is not grammatical. So this is the knowledge of sentence structure and the structures which you can physically produce, but they are not grammatical sentences in the language. Although all of those are words in English, but they can't just be randomly combined. Well, I can give you an example. Like, you see even like this one paragraph. If you see this exact same paragraph in another book, what is the first thing that you would think? Yes, plagiarism, right? This is because language is infinite. So if so many words, like one paragraph of words, is exactly produced by another person in exactly the same way, it is more likely that it was plagiarized than actually randomly produced in the way that another person had already produced it. That's how creative language is. So we don't expect this much similarity between different sentences. And there are billions of people throughout history speaking the same language, like at least a language like English. But we don't expect them to produce the exact same paragraph, and sometimes not even the exact same sentence. This is a creative aspect of language, which is fascinating. It's like every sentence or every paragraph is like a fingerprint. Thanks for your time and attention, and see you again soon.